The transformation has accelerated in the last few years.
I think we're also really excited, not just about open source, but more kind of agile ways of working that can kind of bring us kind of action to those changes, right? So it's one thing to have the technology, but the process and the ways of working need to move with it as well. Otherwise, we won't really reap the benefits.
You need change management is really, really critical for open source rollouts as well as for new platforms, because most of the people you're working with, they're focused on generating evidence, not how we generate evidence.
How do you actually start? This is where we bridge the gap between innovation and scientific discovery. This is where technology meets science, a podcast by Epsilon. Each episode brings you insights from industry leaders who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible in life sciences. Enjoy, and if you like the series, click that subscribe button. This series is brought to you by Epsilon, a technology company that empowers pharmaceutical and life science companies to leverage open source technology for faster, data-driven decision-making in regulated environments. Welcome back. Happy Thursday. You are listening or watching Where Technology Meets Science, and today we will be talking about technology transformation and clinical trial analysis. Pharma has been one of the slowest industries to adapt to modern technologies, and it has traditionally relied on proprietary tools for tasks ranging from drug discovery to regulatory submissions. But with open source tools growing in popularity and companies like Roche, Novo Nordisk, GSK, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Pfizer, making significant steps towards open source and making big contributions in open source technology, the transformation has accelerated in the last few years. And on top of that, the FDA permits to use open source for analyzing clinical trial data. And that encourages companies to explore more within that area and use R as a viable solution for regulatory submissions. And today I'm going to speak one of the industry leaders in the space who are at the forefront of this transformation. Two guests from Novartis, Orla Doyle, Senior Director, and James Black, Executive Director in Technology and Scientific Computing. Welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thanks,
Ned.
I want to start with a short question about your background. Could you describe briefly your role and experience with introducing the pharmaceutical industry into the 21st century technology? And maybe starts with you, Orla.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an engineer by training. And I suppose since I graduated, I guess the common thread in my career has always been working on kind of patient level data, which has never ceased to fascinate me and also challenge me relentlessly. And I've worked on things from kind of machine learning to predict diagnoses. I've worked on kind of larger data, so brain images. I've worked on kind of the transpose of that, right, which is kind of narrow and data with lots and lots of rows. And yeah, I never lost the fascination. I've spent some time in academia, and then I moved into the private sector working for a company called IQVIA, where we worked on both real-world data and clinical trial data. And since joining Novartis, I've kind of moved more into tooling, so kind of supporting teams who are doing the analysis and trying to understand where we can bring automation and reuse of code to their work to ultimately help them to kind of focus on the things that are more valuable to them. So it's been a really exciting time. And then I lead this open source enablement journey within advanced quantitative sciences. So here, like many pharma companies, we're looking to adopt more modern tooling into our kind of clinical trial analysis and reporting. So we're kind of at the start of that process and moving through it.
It's a long journey. And you, James?
Yeah. Yes, I'm originally an epidemiologist, and then straight from grad school, went into the real world evidence team at Roche. And it was a bit of a blank slate there. Like we were kind of getting to define our own ways of working and setting up our own databases. So it was an opportunity to jump into stuff like Markdown and Shiny, and we use Git and Jira and stuff like that. So it was a lot of opportunity to kind of get more into the ways of working. And I think that kind of career trajectory is something I've stuck with. So a real focus rather not on the clinical questions, but more on how we can answer the questions. I guess a lot of parallels there with Orla. And then when Roche started its real world evidence and personalized healthcare platform, I got quite deeply involved. And by the time it was in production, I was the business owner. So kind of overseeing the strategy of the program. And yeah, you talked a little bit about the pharma can be quite slow. I think a lot of my colleagues in research will get quite defensive there because I think the research side of the company is often very, very innovative and they're jumping on the latest technology and methodology. I think it's more for us in development where there's a big focus on rigor and providing evidence to health regulators, health authorities. There's a lot more kind of inertia we have to overcome. And so when Roche's original SCE kind of faltered a bit, and there was an opportunity to try and bring what we'd done in the real world evidence space to clinical trials. So I jumped on that. And it was definitely a learning, kind of trying to move from this little agile boat to moving a tanker into a new direction. And so that's in production now. And so super excited to be at Novartis now, working with Orla and many others on the new scientific computing environment there.
And then when we talk about technology transformation within the clinical trials analysis and reporting, we often think about open source and R. And can we talk about technology transformation without talking about open source? What's more into that? Can start with Orla.
Yeah, sure. I think so. I'm based in Dublin, and I have the pleasure of working with lots of people who kind of touch very different parts of that, right? So I can kind of look outside my bubble. And there's so many areas that I think are going to really transform clinical trials and already are. So we think about things like decentralized trials, right? So I'm from a small town. My family still live in a small town. If there was a very innovative clinical trial, logistically, it's super hard for my family, the people I love, to get to it. So if I think really personally from my own perspective, this opportunity that a trial doesn't need to be in a big hub or a particularly world-leading site. Of course, it can be involving that site, but patients can visit in different ways, like perhaps their local doctor can do parts of those visits. That type of work is really, really transformative. Now, there's a lot of very important work to be done. As James said, it's still a tanker, right? We need to understand, are there any biases or anything introduced there that is unintended? So to make sure we don't in any way compromise the kind of quality of our data collection. So in clinical trials, we care a lot about randomization. So we care that there's an active treatment and there's either a standard of care comparison. And we want to make sure there's nothing different between those two groups apart from the administration of the treatment. So again, I think it's a complicated thing to do logistically. It's a complicated thing to think about analytically. But those types of things, they don't require necessarily open source tools, but those are the things that I look at and I think, wow, that could have an amazing impact for patients. And also maybe the quality of the data that we receive in our trials, right, is we're getting better insights. So those types of things, I think, are so exciting, and it's really great to see some of the progress there. I think maybe I'll jump over to James to see what he would say as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about does it equal moving to open source, I guess to me, it definitely involves open source. I saw an article recently that was mentioning there's 60 pharma companies that have an employee between Basel and Zurich. And like, if you think of the regulators, like they want a demographics table, and the way we do it today, 65 companies will have their own internal code that generates a demographics table. And that's just, maybe I should preface this as me speaking on my own rather than from my company, but it's just insane. Like the idea that just in between Basel and Zurich, there might be 65 templates of a demographics table. And then you factor in, we have hundreds of templates. So that's hundreds and hundreds of duplications across companies. So I think that kind of post-competitive stuff is almost like a no-brainer. We should be working together. And it's where stuff like Admiral and Nest come from, like the Pharmaverse. And also true in the statistical space with like the initiatives under OpenStatsWare. But that doesn't mean like we can't build an SCE without a cloud provider. So you're going to have proprietary API calls to AWS, for instance. So I think it's impossible to have no vendors. And it's also, some informatics things we actually do want to pay a vendor to do because we're not an informatics company. We're focused on medicine. But when we get down to our domain, I think that's where we should be working together, and we should be focusing on, if it is post or pre-competitive, can this be open source and collaborative rather than each company internally doing the same thing?
And what you mentioned about like we should be working together, because you actually have a lot of experience and contributions in participating and contributing to and also setting up different working groups, including our consortium. Could you tell a little bit more about like what's the role of those groups in moving the needle a little bit further and a little bit faster?
Yeah, so for me, the R consortium, I've kind of slightly hung my hat up there and focused more on infrastructure in the last year or so. But I used to be involved in the R consortium, and I think there it's doing that. It's providing a mechanism to kind of bring companies together within kind of a nonprofit. That's also thinking about things like making sure that there's no anti-competitive behavior. Like if the companies are coming together, they provide that governance for the collaborations. And also the health authorities, they don't want to talk to individual pharma companies. So the R consortium is a really important vehicle for us to be able to kind of take topics like how can we do. I mean, one of the really kind of blue sky ones is this idea around interactive CSRs, so interactive submissions. That's a conversation a group like the R consortium can kind of mediate between the companies and the regulators. But I know Orla is involved in some of these initiatives like OpenStatsWare. So I don't know if you can build on that, Orla.
Yeah, I think exactly right, James. And I think it gives us a forum to say, sometimes you find yourself alone with a problem and you think, oh, maybe it's, and not that you think it's only you that has that problem, but you don't always have a mechanism to say, hey, how would you do it? Or what have you found? But I think those groups, what they do is they identify common problems and they provide a mechanism for us to collaborate on them. And then open source fundamentally provides the way for us to action that, right? So I think it kind of goes from end to end. And I think one of the points James made earlier that still really fascinates me is we do a lot of validation, and that's a very loaded word in our world because it can mean very different things to different people. But in this case, we do validation of the packages or libraries that we want to use in our clinical trial reporting. So instead of just installing it directly, we would say, hey, we're going to put that through a mechanism just to make sure that we think it's high quality, that we think it's sufficiently tested. And a bit like what James was saying with the tables, we all have kind of our own slightly different ways of deciding a package has a certain risk. And I think it would be really interesting, and there's really important work being done through one of these OR consortium working groups to understand, can we have a common repository where we kind of say, hey, we agree fundamentally that this is kind of the workflow, and this is where we can have better governance, but aligned governance. So, and I don't really get the feeling that it's people, right? So I don't think it's people who are saying, no, I'm so attached to my process, I'm not willing to even think about your process. But more again, what James said earlier, we're adopting Agile, but we're still a little bit away from being fully agile in terms of our processes, right? So sometimes those documents can feel like they're written in stone. So the documents that govern how we work. So I think we're also really excited, not just about open source, but more kind of agile ways of working that can kind of bring us kind of action to those changes, right? So it's one thing to have the technology, but the process and the ways of working need to move with it as well. Otherwise, we won't really reap the benefits.
So how do you actually move? Like, where do you start this transformation? Because I would assume that it's like at the very beginning, there's just a lot of things to change. So how do you actually start?
I think you kind of try to pick a problem that affects many people, and then. And James and I have often talked about this, getting all the stakeholders in the room from the start. So I think what we've been guilty of before is kind of saying, I'm going to, work on a tool or work on something. And then when it's finished, so in ourselves, we're being a bit waterfall. When it's finished, I'm going to go to my quality colleagues or my governance colleagues and say, hey, I have my finished process. Do you approve? Whereas instead, I think having them at the table from the very beginning, understanding, how am I making sure I'm meeting their requirements and having that full set of kind of holistic view of what we need to do. So I think, and being a bit relentless, right? So change is hard. You need to kind of be ready that sometimes you will kind of hit a barrier and you need to continue to move it. So I think having those people who are kind of, a bit relentless in what they do, not in any kind of problematic way, right? But you need to kind of push a change through. And as I said, picking something there where it's going to mean something to as many people as you can in your company, right? So they see that change and they think, so maybe things can change. And then you kind of move it from there. But I think, James, you've been through this many years as well, so you probably have lots of interesting stories here too.
Yeah, I mean, I think for Orla's point, Shiny's always talked about as like the one where it provided something you couldn't do before. And so a lot of people got into it because of that easy and very, very powerful ability to build interactive applications. I think also with that move to open source, it's not like you're swapping a proc for a function from a different package. There's a real mindset shift, like especially when we couple this with the new scientific computing environments. Like we're talking about going from kind of monolithic, not very often versioned environments to saying, hey, you can pick and choose which exact date you want to use a snapshot from, and which exact versions of packages you want to use. And there's a focus on kind of adopting a lot more tooling, which is common in data science, like Git for version control. And kind of historically, we had these really, really dense abstractions that are really tailored to just the process you follow to generate a CSR. And I think that's being challenged a lot now. I think there's a lot of thinking around, do we want the process of generating these tables and plots to be incredibly like guided as they have historically, or do we want to kind of provide more of a data science-esque experience where there's a lot more agility into doing things in different ways, but also a lot less guardrails. And so if you're used to pressing a button to promote a file, suddenly being told, hey, we're going to use Git is kind of like, well, you're giving me this massive Swiss Army knife and all I need to do is, make a single cut. So it's a little bit overwhelming, and different companies, I think, have taken different approaches. Some, I think, have said, we're all data scientists now. We're going to learn these tools. I think some other companies have said, we're going to go somewhere in between in terms of how deeply we abstract away the tooling from the users.
And I want to come back to the abstractions in a second, but also I want to ask you, Orla, because you mentioned that you have to pick a problem that will involve a lot of different stakeholders and put them into one room. So what kind of problems, what problems would you choose or on what kind of basis?
Yeah, so I think the first problem that we worked on was that one I mentioned earlier, which was package validation. This was a very kind of, I would say, pretty global problem. So before we could start using the language Orla and the packages, we needed to have a working practice and a process to bring all of this together and then provision these packages regularly. So that's one of the first ones we took. So that's kind of like really like across the board. Then when we worked a lot with statisticians, they would say simple things like, well, I don't really like working in Microsoft Word. Sometimes I have to copy and paste something in. So that actually really frustrates me. And sometimes I don't know that I copied and pasted the right thing. So what we talked about is using tools like Markdown and Quarto to actually go from an environment that still feels like code, but at the end, the product is a Word document. And what really interested me and still interests me about that problem is the product that the user consumes at the end, whether that's a clinician or a medical writer or another stakeholder, is the same for them. But the way that the statistician can get there is fundamentally different and better for them. So when you think to affect that change, you don't need to kind of say, hey, I want my, maybe people who don't code often, I want them to be in a very technical environment. They can stay where they are. But actually your statistician or your programmer can move and change their experience of creating that. And that really, really interests me because sometimes I think when we come with new technology, we kind of, maybe we overpromise and then people get disappointed. So I think sometimes the changes that are going to be easier to affect, I think is also really interesting. So we've tried to balance the problems that we work on in that way. And then, of course, I think broadly, like many companies, we're working on that classic workflow where we go from, different versions of our data to analysis-ready data to the outputs that we want to bring to health authorities. So we're working across that pipeline as well. But then again, trying to find things that we think will be quick to release, quick to get to production. So again, we want our teams to be excited. We want the people who joined our teams who perhaps are used to working in a very different way for them to see, pockets of change more quickly than kind of waiting for a big bang at the end.
And that's really a question for both of you in terms of like the challenges, the most common challenges that you encounter when introducing those changes in the clinical trial analysis.
I guess maybe there's this acknowledgement that not everyone's excited about technology or like how, I talked about how I'm excited about how we generate evidence, that's not the motivation for everyone. Some people are interested in the clinical question or delivering to the stakeholders. And so if we bring out new tooling or new processes or new languages, there's a learning phase. And during that learning phase, you're not going to be as effective. So I think one thing I've often seen is like there's a number of people that kind of jump on this new technology or even pioneer it, like within their own studies. There's kind of this middle ground who, once they see it's better or it becomes a department direction, they'll jump on board. And then there's a bunch of people who maybe are a little bit more recalcitrant against it. And often it's because they're very good at the current processes. They might have been doing it for 10 years. And we're essentially telling them, all that experience you've built up in the current process and the current languages has a little bit of a reset, learning the new languages and the new tools and the new platforms. So I think it's just being aware that you need change management is really, really critical for open source rollouts as well as for new platforms, because most of the people you're working with, they're focused on generating evidence, not how we generate evidence.
And also, do you see, just want to follow-up question, do you see the same level of resistance in the same group of, not necessarily at Novartis, but in different companies, also at the director level or managerial level?
Yeah, I mean, for the scientific computing environments, you can kind of just look at what is the next gen platform each company's picked. And it's very insightful, I think, into how that company's leadership are thinking. Because some people are kind of picking up, the same products that we used 5-10 years ago. Whereas some people are kind of being very, very bold, and some people are kind of coming in the middle in terms of adopting general data science platforms. It does publicly manifest, I think, in terms of which strategy they're taking with their scientific computing environment. And I guess the pharma versus Orla is maybe another one where you see public commitments.
And Orla, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges in that transformation?
I think the biggest challenge I see is sometimes we think it's only a technical problem. And so if I say to, a bit like, again, to echo many of things James said, if I say to someone who's very skilled at another technology, hey, use this other tool, I mean, the natural question is why, right? Is it better? Is it faster? Is it going to be more kind of efficient, or the visualizations better? And there's obviously big ticket items like Shiny, like graphics, right, are a step change better in these open source tools. But I think we really need to make sure we bring process, like new ways of working, and marry that with the change in technology. And I think that's really, really interesting. So I suppose one area that I can think of there is when we think of how we generate our outputs. Today, they're often static outputs in kind of a rich text format file. So it's a very flat, very static, and no longer really a piece of data. And difficult to manipulate if you wanted to. So therefore, we can think of intermediate steps like analysis results data sets, where we're actually still storing our data. It's in a standardized format. It's machine readable, right? So there's lots of things we can do with it afterwards, and it gives us more flexibility. So I think when we go in that way and we try to understand, hey, if we change the process and we bring this, do you think that's interesting? And then that's a very different conversation. And whether the tool is one technology or another is kind of pushed down the conversation, because people are now interested in, what will that give me for my trial? How can I iterate faster? When I want to change a footnote, I can have a much better experience. So I think the challenge that we have now as people like myself and James, we need to make sure that we fully understand what the incentives are for the people we're asking to change, and that we also are so embedded in the process that we can see those advantages and we go there in that direction. So we have to be very good listeners, and then we also have to make sure, as I said, it's not a translation exercise. So if we just translate all of our code and tools into another language, I mean, who cares, right? It's not going to be a very exciting thing. Whereas if we bring all of these advantages, best practices, ways of working, I mean, that's where the real value is, I think.
So what are the incentives if you were to convince your team or a company, if another pharmaceutical company, like why you should care and why you should move to open source, why you should embrace the modern technologies? What are the advantages and benefits?
Maybe I can go with a few, and then James, you can as well. I suppose one of the things is kind of retention and attraction of talent, right? So if we're looking at the talent coming out of university today, they know open source tools. and their expectation is to continue developing and getting better. So if we say, well, come to Novartis and use other proprietary tools, which are not really that transferable across industry, it's not really a good value proposition for them in terms of their development and their progression. Equally for our existing talent, right? They want us to change, right? They want to see evolution, and they want to see improvement in how they work, right? So we need to deliver it both for the incoming talent and the existing talent. I think when we think about, and this is something again, James and I've been talking a lot about, we have these kind of standards when we work in pharma. We say, hey, this, if we want to think about adverse events in a clinical trial, we have a way to show that, right? We have a table that we create. We shouldn't be, using a lot of our people's time on that, right? It's not something that is, intellectually challenging for them. So really bringing automation so that they can go from very standard things takes them very little time, so that they can then focus on the complex things that we do. Because every study has its own nuance. When we think of how we're going to provide the evidence for the safety and efficacy of that product, they're always a little bit custom, right? And that's where we really want to make sure people have more time to spend on that. And then I think the obvious ones, again, we've already mentioned in data visualization. There's so much energy, time, and people hours into collecting the data in a clinical trial. You have people who are unwell, and we're collecting information from them. It is our responsibility to make sure that data is as insightful and as explored as it possibly can be, right? We need to get as much as we can out of it. So if we have better tools for our teams to do that, that also makes them feel like, I think they're more excited about what they're doing. They feel like they're doing a better job in that. And then I guess future proofing is a huge one. So we see new frameworks coming in with our regulators. We think of how we produce our evidence. There's things like estimate frameworks, how we impute missing data. All of those things are evolving, and it's the open source tools that are keeping pace. It's not our proprietary tools that are evolving, in sync. So at some point, our teams will say, well, I can't use that. I need to use this. So they really want to be able to use the best tools for what they're doing as well. So that's my slightly longer answer. But yeah, I'm sure James has a lot of insights here as well.
Yeah, no, I think you hit all the major points. Orla, maybe as a more minor one, I always thought it was weird. You'd come across so many examples in studies where the trial was designed using R by the statistician. Then the statistician's looking at all the critical stuff using R. And at the FDA, often they're kind of pulling up the SCTMs and looking at them themselves using the R language. But then the actual execution was done by a stats programmer in SAS. And it's just weird to have like two people who should be working very, very closely together speak a different language and use like totally different tools to do the same thing. So I think one of the nice positives is that it's bringing the statistical community closer to the stats programming community as well, to put them both onto the same language as their backbone.
Yeah, I think it's essential that we started to speak the same language, and communicate more efficiently. Okay, let's just quickly, before we wrap up, speak about abstractions. I don't know, James, this is the topic that you have been very excited about. So could you explain what are the abstractions, data abstractions, and what is their role in clinical trial?
Yeah, I mean, so I guess abstractions is literally most of what I do as the SCE product owner. So we started from a base data science platform, and our focus is essentially layering on top a layer which makes our people more efficient. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff there around like security and compliance and auditability. But I think what really impacts the users is we're putting this layer on top and deciding how thick that layer should be for each of the different roles we have to make their work more efficient. And so, yeah, I think abstractions are really important to kind of, if you just give someone Git and an RStudio instance and access to a database, actually you're making them much less efficient because you're missing the ability to kind of inject specifications and standards and integrate with all the things upstream and downstream. There's a lot of stuff there which is just kind of too much micromanagement. We want to give them workspaces that are ready to roll and let them customize from there, not tell them build your own environments, like with your own packages and stuff like that. So yeah, essentially most of what we do in the SCE team is trying to figure out what abstractions help our users and will make them more efficient. And I think data abstractions, I think, is maybe a slightly more focused topic, but I think that's also I don't know if an ARD is a data abstraction, but I kind of think of stuff like SQL views or the dbplyr package, which just makes it so easy to work with data. Like you think you're working with something in your R environment, and behind the scenes, it's managing the DBI database connections and doing SQL queries and stuff like that. So those kind of data abstractions can also just make life a lot easier. People don't have to know server names and the location of a particular table. They can just focus on the work they need to do.
And then any like challenges or objections or risks involved in using abstractions?
I guess you can ruin a platform if your abstractions are too strict. You'd kind of lock people out of agility. And I think that's that balancing act. Like historically, the kind of, I was about to mention vendors there. There are certain SCEs out there which are very tailored to stats programming, and they have very, very deep abstractions, which then make them kind of very difficult to use for general data science or PK analysis or for a statistician. So I think it's making sure we have that agility to allow people to do the work they need to do, be that exploratory or be that, GXP, but requiring more CPUs, or just kind of routine, generate an atom or something like that.
And Orla, do you have anything to add here? What's your take on the abstractions?
Yeah, I think exactly, what you were just saying at the end, James. I guess how we imagine it is the ability to kind of opt in and out, right? So if someone wants something at a very, kind of raw level, then that's still there for them. So we don't want to kind of like block that route. But when we think about onboarding people and they're moving from very different technology to technology like Git, right? You can do so many things with Git, but you need to make sure we have a clear path. So people are like, right, the first things I need to use are these, and I go down my path. And then if that's through an abstraction, over time, then they're more exposed to that. They can peel it back should they want to. But also if they don't want to and they want to focus on the data and they want to focus on where their expertise is, that's also fine, right? So I think it's kind of trying to make sure that it feels like we have as much flexibility as we can. And also we understand we have like very different personas, right? Like people are just curious about really different things. And some people will not want to know at all about what's happening with version control, and other people will want to know exactly to the last degree. And I think it's just about embracing that and making sure that as much as we can, this platform feels like a good place to be for those different types of personas. And I think with the abstractions, prioritizing probably our programming workflows where we have a lot of kind of process driven steps, but then for other areas kind of recognizing, well, there's so many different journeys or user journeys that really here we need to take a slightly different approach. So, and I think James has been doing a lot of thinking and work there as well. So I think it's going to make our SCE, a really exciting place to be for a broad range of people.
Okay, I'll have two more questions. Like one would be like, what do you think is going to be like the next biggest changes in the pharmaceutical industry in terms of like technology transformation? So we can start with Orla.
I suppose the obvious one is kind of meaningful adoption of AI. So I think we already have AI itself in different areas of Novartis. But when we think, I suppose, where we are today is more in this kind of development space as clinical trial analysis and reporting. There's lots of things where it's difficult to make tools for. So when we think of these standard tables that we talked about earlier, so imagine you're counting the number of adverse events across different kind of areas. Those things, right, we probably don't require a kind of an AI tool there. We can probably get really far with automation. But then there's a lot of aspects of what we do that are quite custom, that really having kind of an AI companion, so to speak, probably really would help people. Even from really simple things like documenting the code to kind of all the way up to kind of, how we can improve the code, to even kind of working on some of the QC as well, I think are some of the really important. And I think right now we have this kind of new platform, new technology, AI kind of sitting together. And I think there's lots of things we can do and good decisions we can make, both in open source and our SE, to make sure that we can leverage AI and Gen AI down the line. So if we talked earlier about storing results as data sets, that's very consumable then, by model because it has a standard structure, and it is, machine readable. So that kind of unlocks what we can do, right? So, some of the time, you want to make a really nice figure, maybe AI can propose some code that would make that figure really nice. So it's somewhat low risk, but it's actionable. And it also could really change the experience of our teams, where we don't want to take away the focus on the intellectual creative work, but instead we want to have automation and AI, help them in areas where they feel it's a blocker and they probably don't want to focus on, right? So creating the exact right command for a particular plot is probably something people will be happy for that to be taken away from them. So those, I think, are the changes, and that's kind of the trinity that I think we have in our future next few years, for sure.
And on your side, James?
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what Orla was saying. And I kind of see this, like Orla talked about these kind of no-brainer wins. And so like actually we haven't figured out how to do automation very well yet. So even before jumping to AI, I think there's some things we need to sort out in terms of just automation. And there's often a split between like AI can do the work versus AI can support the work. And I think Orla gave some really good examples of like easy, quick wins to support the work. I know Vincent Shen has done some talks about this as well at, I can't remember if it was Hughes or Pharma, sorry. But there's a lot we can be doing, which is very low effort and actually has a pretty substantial benefit, like RAG onto documentation or providing coding assistance. But there's a really interesting debate, and I feel like it's something which is almost daily talked about, which is like, okay, well, if the AI is doing the work, like when can we trust it? Can we ever trust it? Like what's the role of the human? So I'm talking about like, generating an atom or generating a plot or a table. We can't use that initially because we need to have some sort of check that it's correct. And I think understanding that role between the AI and the human, who I guess is the person signing off on this, is something where it's a really interesting discussion. And I don't know where it's going at the moment, but it's an interesting discussion.
Yeah, because it is. If you need the person to still verify the work of AI, then what's the point of introducing that algorithm when the work has to be done and it takes similar time? Gabriel, one more last question that we ask all of our guests. You kind of touched on this, James. I don't know if there's anything else. What's the problem in your field that you're surprised that hasn't been solved yet? Maybe we can start with James this time.
Automation. I think I've worked at 2 pharma companies, and I have talked to a lot of people in stats programming from other companies, and it just amazes me, like something like a safety table. Why are we still having to like hand program a bunch of stuff there? Like we know the inputs, the tables are often identical. I guess it just surprises me how. So there are some companies that are getting there now. But it just took us a very long time, I think, to sort out this kind of relatively easy automation. So yeah, that was a big surprise to me, I think, coming into industry.
And for you, Orla?
Yeah, very much agree with James. That was also a surprise to me. And then maybe very relatedly, it was also really, so when I first joined pharma, they were like, well, we have these Novartis safety tables and we have the Roche safety tables, and then FDA have some suggestion of safety tables. And I was like, gosh, they must all be really different, because otherwise we would just all use the same ones, right? But actually there aren't that many differences between them. So what I'm really hopeful and looking forward to, and I think it will take us a little bit of time, is, actually aligning on a common set of standards. I think that would transform our tooling as well. So right now, because we have these internal standards, it's kind of hard to have a tool that's fit for purpose for everyone. So we kind of want to make this aspect of a bit of a connector or kind of a helper package. So it's in the standards and also in the package validation. I think it would be great to think about how we can be much more aligned on what we think is kind of a low, medium, high risk or a risk spectrum of a package. And then perhaps what we do with that can be bespoke, but really making sure that we don't have these different processes that really don't amount to much different in the end. And that kind of surprised me. Maybe that's just complete naivety though, because I think, it's hard to get big companies to agree on things. But yeah, I think those things surprise me. I hope we can improve it. And like with the automation, like that's a game changer, right? If you're automating for the common way of saying this is a safety table across many companies, that's another kind of access to our automation, I think, as well. So yeah, let's see where that goes.
Yeah, I think there's still a lot to be done in that space. But I want to thank you so much for the conversation. I feel like we could continue for a very long time, but we are running out of time. So thank you so much. It was very insightful. And then thank you all listeners for being with us. And if you feel like this episode might be interesting to somebody you know, please share it with them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nat.
Cool.
Thanks for hosting us.
Thanks. Thank you for listening. This was Where Technology Meets Science by Epsilon. If you know someone who might enjoy this episode, share it with them and subscribe to never miss a new episode. At Epsilon, we empower pharmaceutical and life science companies to leverage open source technology for faster data-driven decision-making in regulated environments. Until the next time.